When you stop texting and calling a man, the absence of communication can have a powerful impact on him. Initially, he may not realize the significance of your presence in his life. It's easy to take someone for granted when they're always around, providing attention and companionship. But as soon as that consistent communication stops, something shifts. He begins to notice the emptiness, the void that you once filled. This isn't necessarily about the specific texts or calls themselves, but about the connection they represented. The small, everyday conversations, the shared moments of laughter, and the comfort of knowing someone is always just a text away. All of these things matter more than we often realize. When you stop texting and calling, a man will start to feel a sense of loss. Even if he hasn't consciously acknowledged how much he relies on you for emotional support or companionship, the absence of these small exchanges makes him stop and think. It's like the sudden quiet after the noise of daily life. The silence can be deafening. He may start to feel disconnected, and the things he once took for granted become glaringly absent. This feeling of loss isn't just about the lack of communication, it's also about the emotional bond that starts to fade. When you're actively reaching out, there's an implied understanding that you both value each other's time and attention. The act of texting or calling is a way of saying, I care enough to keep this connection alive. Without that, he may begin to realize that perhaps he's been neglecting something important. Even if it's not always visible on the surface, emotional connections thrive on consistent effort. By taking that effort away, you unintentionally create space for him to miss what he once had. It's not uncommon for someone to only truly appreciate the presence of another once it's no longer there. The absence is a powerful catalyst for self-reflection. He might begin to wonder why the communication stopped, and in doing so, he could start to assess his own feelings. This pause allows him to evaluate the relationship from a different perspective. He may start to ask himself questions that he hadn't considered before, such as, what does she mean to me? What was I taking for granted? How did I feel when we were talking regularly? In many cases, these reflections can lead to a realization that he misses the dynamic you shared, the connection that was once so familiar and comforting. There's also a psychological element to this. People often crave what they cannot easily have. When you're always available, it can sometimes be overlooked, but when you pull back and create some distance, it triggers a more instinctual response. A man might start to feel that he's losing something valuable, something that he didn't fully appreciate until it was out of reach. This sense of missing you is not just emotional, it can also be physical. He might find himself thinking about you more often, reminiscing about the moments you shared. The absence of communication causes him to shift his focus from the mundane to the meaningful, and suddenly the small things, your smile, your voice, your presence, become significant in a way they hadn't before. In some cases, this longing can be a wake-up call. He might start to consider the ways in which he's neglected the relationship and realize that he hasn't been putting in the effort to maintain the connection. It's a humbling experience for many people to realize that they've been taking someone's time and attention for granted. The loss of communication forces him to reassess his role in the relationship and whether he's truly giving it the attention it deserves. This self-awareness can spark a change in how he approaches not just your relationship, but his interactions with others as well. However, the feeling of missing you isn't always immediate. It may take some time for him to truly feel the absence of your presence. At first, he might be indifferent, thinking that your decision to stop texting and calling is just a phase. But as the days go by, and the silence continues, he may begin to recognize the depth of the gap that has formed between you. This growing awareness might eventually lead to a deeper emotional reaction, a longing to reconnect, a desire to restore the communication that has been lost. It's also worth noting that this reaction can be amplified by how emotionally invested he is in the relationship. If he genuinely cares about you, the absence will feel more pronounced. He may find himself actively missing your company, your conversations, and the emotional support you provided. The more he cares, the more significant your absence will be. On the other hand, if his investment in the relationship was shallow, the absence might not have the same effect. However, even then, he might still feel some level of discomfort or curiosity, as the lack of communication is often a sign of a deeper shift in the dynamics of the relationship. In essence, when you stop texting and calling, it forces a man to confront the absence of something important in his life. It may take time for him to fully recognize the impact of this absence, but eventually the void will make him reflect on what you brought to the relationship. He will start to miss you not just for the text messages or calls, but for the deeper connection that was once there. The absence will create a space for him to reflect, and in doing so, he will come to understand just how much he values the connection you shared. Ultimately, it is the space you create that leads to a powerful realization about the importance of consistent communication and emotional investment in any relationship. When you stop texting and calling a man, the absence of communication will often lead him to reflect on his behavior and how it affects the relationship. Initially, he may not realize how much of the connection he took for granted, assuming that you'll always be there to initiate the conversation, always available to provide support, attention, and companionship. But when that familiar pattern stops, the reality begins to set in. The silence may make him feel confused or even anxious as he struggles to make sense of the shift in the dynamic between you. The moment you stop reaching out, it creates a space that forces him to think about his role in the relationship and how he's been contributing to its current state. He might initially react by questioning what went wrong or why the sudden change occurred. It's not uncommon for a person to be unaware of how their actions or lack of action have impacted the other person. In relationships, people often fall into routines where communication becomes expected and no longer consciously valued, but when you stop initiating contact, it can be a wake-up call. He may wonder why you're not texting or calling, and what that means about the connection you two once shared. This pause in communication forces him to step back and evaluate the significance of the relationship. He might start asking himself questions like, did I do something wrong? Is she upset with me? Did I take her for granted? These thoughts might lead him to reconsider the way he's been treating you and whether he's been giving enough of himself emotionally or mentally to the relationship. For many men, the absence of communication can evoke feelings of insecurity. When things are moving smoothly and contact is frequent, there's a sense of stability. The sudden stop, however, brings uncertainty. It often forces him to confront his own emotional vulnerability. This discomfort can be particularly significant if he values the relationship deeply, as he now has to face the reality that something may be missing or lacking in his actions. His emotional response to the silence may start as confusion or frustration, but it can soon turn into concern. As time goes on, he may realize that the relationship, which once felt so secure, is now in jeopardy. The communication was the glue that held things together, and without it, the bond begins to weaken. Another reason why he will react when you stop texting or calling is because it challenges his sense of control. In many cases, people don't consciously realize how much they rely on others to maintain a certain level of emotional regulation in their lives. When you stop reaching out, he might start feeling a loss of control over the dynamic, as if something that once felt predictable and dependable is now slipping away. The lack of communication may cause him to feel like he's losing you, and this feeling of loss can be deeply unsettling. It's not that he necessarily doesn't want to communicate, it's that he may not have been putting in enough effort to maintain the connection. The absence of contact forces him to confront the reality that if he doesn't make an effort, the relationship may no longer stay as strong or even continue at all. His reaction to this loss of control could vary. If he genuinely cares about the relationship, he may begin to feel a sense of urgency. The idea of losing the connection or the person he's taken for granted can provoke a strong emotional reaction. In this case, he may attempt to reconnect, possibly reaching out with questions or apologies in an effort to understand the change and make amends. His instinct might be to regain control by reestablishing the communication that was once regular. However, if he hasn't truly invested emotionally in the relationship or doesn't feel as attached, he might not react in a way that aligns with your expectations. In some cases, his response might be indifference or a reluctance to address the issue, which could indicate that his feelings or commitment to the relationship are not as strong as you initially thought. On a deeper level, his reaction may also be tied to his sense of worth in the relationship. Men, like anyone, want to feel valued and appreciated, and communication plays a significant role in how that value is expressed. When you stop texting and calling, it may force him to question whether he truly is valued or whether the relationship is worth continuing. If the communication had been one-sided, with you doing most of the initiating, the absence of texts or calls can bring about feelings of rejection. He might begin to feel like the emotional investment isn't mutual, or that his actions have led to a shift in your feelings toward him. This sense of rejection or insecurity can make him react by either stepping up to prove his worth or withdrawing even further. However, for some men, this shift in communication could lead them to examine their own priorities. The silence might spark a self-reflection that wasn't possible when the relationship was constantly reinforced through regular texts and calls. It forces him to think about the relationship from a different perspective. What was it that drew him to you in the first place? How have things evolved? Does he truly want to put in the effort to make things work, or is the relationship simply convenient for him? These are the types of questions that come up when you stop texting and calling. Without the constant back and forth, he has time to think and evaluate whether he's been truly invested or if he's just been going through the motions. In essence, stopping communication with a man can stir up a mix of emotions in him. The uncertainty, loss of control, and self-reflection that follow this change can make him realize the depth of his feelings for you and the significance of your presence in his life. While he may not react immediately, the absence of communication will likely trigger a cascade of emotions, thoughts, and realizations. Over time, this pause in contact forces him to address what he truly values, not just in the relationship, but also in himself. The absence of texting and calling becomes a powerful tool that allows both parties to gain clarity and insight into their emotional needs and the true nature of their connection. When you stop texting or calling a man, it can prompt him to reevaluate his own behavior and actions, leading to a realization that something has shifted. In many relationships, communication is the lifeblood that sustains the connection, creating a sense of closeness and understanding between two people. When that flow of communication is cut off, the man may begin to recognize that he has not been putting in enough effort, or that he has taken the relationship for granted. This pause forces him to come face to face with the reality of the situation, and it is often in this space of silence that clarity begins to emerge. A key aspect of his reaction is the realization of how much he may have depended on you for emotional validation and reassurance. When he stops hearing from you, it can be a wake-up call for him. He might have assumed that you would always be there, reaching out and showing your interest, but now with that source of connection gone, he finds himself questioning what happened. He may start to reflect on the moments when he took your presence for granted, the times he didn't reciprocate the effort you put into maintaining the communication, or the moments when he wasn't fully present in the relationship. In this space of silence, he can no longer ignore the imbalance that may have existed in the dynamic between the two of you. This sudden stop in communication also leads to a more introspective view of the relationship. When he is used to hearing from you regularly, he becomes accustomed to the rhythm of the relationship. The texts, the calls, the small conversations that serve as everyday check-ins are often seen as indicators of emotional connection. When those are no longer present, he might feel an emotional void that pushes him to look inward and analyze his own feelings. He may start asking himself why he didn't take the time to appreciate the consistent communication that you offered. This introspection can serve as a wake-up call for him to reconsider his priorities in the relationship and realize that his actions or lack thereof might have contributed to the emotional distance. Moreover, this break in communication can trigger feelings of vulnerability. Many people take relationships for granted, assuming that the bond will continue without much effort. But when you stop initiating contact, it can create a feeling of loss or even fear in the other person. For some men, this realization comes as a shock. The absence of messages and calls may create a sense of insecurity and fear that they are losing something important. If the relationship has been one where the man has not put in enough emotional investment or effort, he might feel guilty when confronted with the silence. This guilt can prompt him to take action and try to reestablish communication, often with a sense of urgency, as he realizes that he has to take responsibility for his part in the relationship's dynamic. On a deeper level, stopping communication can also make him confront the possibility that he may not be as emotionally invested as he once thought. Relationships thrive on mutual effort and understanding, and when you stop reaching out, he is forced to consider whether he has been truly engaged or simply complacent. The absence of communication provides an opportunity for him to assess his own role in the relationship and evaluate if he is as emotionally connected as he should be. If he values the relationship, this break might push him to reprioritize his actions and be more intentional with his efforts moving forward. If he has been distant or emotionally unavailable, the silence can prompt him to realize that he needs to change in order to preserve the relationship. At the same time, his response to the silence may reveal his emotional maturity and level of self-awareness. For some men, the absence of communication might push them to react impulsively, feeling frustrated or even angry. In these cases, the silence may challenge his comfort zone leading him to act out of fear of losing you. On the other hand, a more emotionally mature individual may use this time of silence to reflect on his actions and understand the deeper meaning behind the pause in communication. This introspective approach allows him to reassess what he wants from the relationship and what he needs to do to move forward in a healthier way. This silence also acts as a tool of self-discovery, both for you and for him. As you stop texting or calling, you create the space necessary for him to realize what he truly values in the relationship. The absence of your presence can trigger a revaluation of his feelings, and he may come to understand that he has neglected certain aspects of the relationship. This self-awareness can lead him to take ownership of his actions and perhaps even apologize or express his desire to do better. In other cases, it might be the catalyst for him to recognize that the relationship is not as meaningful as he once believed, prompting him to let go and move on. The key here is that the silence is not just a form of punishment or a way to get his attention, it's a way to provide both of you with the space to reflect on the relationship's true value. By stopping the communication, you create the opportunity for him to realize what he may have been missing. This period of reflection is crucial for both parties to understand their emotional needs and assess whether they are willing to put in the effort required to make the relationship work. In essence, when you stop texting or calling a man, it forces him to take a step back and reassess the relationship from a different perspective. It challenges him to confront his behavior, reflect on his level of emotional investment, and consider how his actions have affected the dynamic between the two of you. Whether it leads to a renewed sense of commitment or the realization that things have changed irreparably, this silence can bring about the clarity necessary for both of you to move forward with greater understanding and intention. The key takeaway is that silence is not just avoided, it is a powerful tool for self-reflection, growth, and understanding, allowing both individuals to evaluate their needs, desires, and level of commitment in the relationship. When you stop texting and calling, a man will often begin to feel a sense of urgency that pushes him to take action. This sense of urgency can manifest in a variety of ways depending on his emotional investment in the relationship and his awareness of the growing distance between you. Initially, he may feel a sense of confusion or even frustration as he tries to make sense of the silence. The communication that once felt routine is now absent, leaving him questioning what went wrong and why things have changed. In many cases, this abrupt shift forces him to face a reality that he may have been avoiding, the fact that his actions or inactions have led to a disconnect. This period of silence can serve as a wake-up call for him. If he values the relationship, he may quickly recognize that something has shifted, and he may feel an internal need to repair the situation before it escalates further. This realization often comes with a strong emotional reaction. He may feel a mix of regret, confusion, or even guilt for not having been more attentive in the first place. The absence of your texts and calls creates an emotional void that he may have been subconsciously relying on you to fill. Now that you've stopped reaching out, he is forced to confront the fact that he has been taking your presence for granted. This can lead to a strong desire to make amends, and in many cases he will reach out to you in an attempt to restore the connection. For some men, this period of silence can also trigger a deeper sense of insecurity. When the communication stops, he may start to wonder whether he has lost your interest or if he has missed an opportunity to prove his worth to you. This insecurity often arises from the fear of losing something valuable, especially if he was not fully aware of how much he depended on your attention and affection. The silence forces him to evaluate the strength of his feelings for you and his desire to maintain the relationship. If he has been complacent or passive in the relationship, the sudden absence of your communication can make him realize just how much he actually cares. This newfound awareness can spur him into action, prompting him to reach out with a renewed sense of purpose. Another reaction he may have is to reassess his own behavior and how it may have contributed to the disconnect. If he recognizes that he has been neglectful, inconsiderate, or distant, the silence will push him to evaluate his own actions. He may realize that he has not been putting in the effort necessary to nurture the relationship, or that he has not been as emotionally available as he should have been. This self-awareness can lead to feelings of regret, as he comes to understand that he has taken your presence for granted. The absence of communication allows him to see the impact of his behavior and the emotional distance that has developed as a result. In some cases, the silence may prompt him to evaluate his own emotional readiness and commitment to the relationship. If he has been hesitant to fully invest or unsure about his feelings, the absence of communication forces him to confront those doubts. He may begin to question whether he truly values the relationship and if he is willing to make the necessary effort to maintain it. For some men, this period of reflection can lead to a stronger commitment to the relationship as they realize that they do not want to lose the connection. For others, the silence may help them realize that they are not as emotionally invested as they thought, leading them to decide to move on. This shift in communication dynamics also opens the door for him to demonstrate his level of maturity and emotional intelligence. If he values you and the relationship, he may approach the silence with a sense of understanding and self-reflection. Rather than becoming defensive or angry, he may use this time to acknowledge his own shortcomings and take responsibility for the lack of communication. He may reach out to you with a genuine desire to reconnect, acknowledging the impact that the silence has had on the relationship. This approach demonstrates emotional maturity and a willingness to work through challenges in a healthy way. On the other hand, if he reacts with frustration, impatience, or hostility, it may reveal a lack of emotional maturity or a failure to take responsibility for his actions. His response to the silence can provide valuable insight into his emotional readiness and his willingness to invest in the relationship. A mature response shows that he is willing to acknowledge the importance of communication and is ready to make changes to improve the dynamic. An immature response, on the other hand, may reveal that he is not yet ready to take accountability for his actions, and it may signal that the relationship is not as healthy as it should be. Ultimately, when you stop texting and calling, the man's reaction will reveal a lot about the state of the relationship and his emotional investment. The silence forces him to confront his own behavior and emotions, and it provides him with the opportunity to either step up and make changes or to realize that he is not as committed as he once thought. His reaction will also offer you valuable insight into whether he values the relationship enough to put in the effort required to make it work. The silence is not just a way to get his attention, it is a tool for self-reflection and growth, both for him and for the relationship as a whole. It allows both parties to evaluate their feelings, needs, and priorities, leading to a deeper understanding of what they want from each other. Whether his reaction is one of regret and desire for change or frustration and withdrawal, it ultimately helps both of you gain clarity on where you stand and what the future holds.